So, welcome to A Tippling Philosopher. As I, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, I interview an author who has brought out a cracking little book here called Science and Spirituality, an Introduction for Students, Secular People and the Generally Curious. So that's Joseph J. Berger. And Joe, welcome to this little chat that we're going to have. First of all, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of a bio?
All right. I got my PhD in biology from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1982. And I then worked, did postdoctoral research at Harvard Medical School and then Tufts School of Medicine, and then another agency at Tufts. And then I went and worked for a couple of years in the biotech industry. And then I went back to my first love, which was always teaching. And so after about 10 years of research, I went to, in 1991, I went to Springfield College, where I have been a biology teacher. And I am a professor of biology at Springfield College now.
Yeah,
so I have about 29 years of teaching at Springfield.
That's some pretty good experience, and I guess biology teaching in the context of people who are interested in sort of philosophy and secularism and the world of religion, especially in America, of course. Being a biology teacher has its challenges, I guess, when you're dealing with ideas of evolution. As far as acceptance.
Yes, but not so much really at the college level.
Yeah.
You don't find much resistance, and really people who have a religious objection to evolution generally don't become biology majors. And I teach biology majors, physician assistant majors, physical therapy majors, and biology majors in my courses. So I haven't encountered non-biologists who I'm sure would have more pushback. But in my evolution class, it's all biology majors and physician assistant majors and so on.
So by that time, they're all fully on board with the idea of evolution. You don't really have any pushback on that.
Yeah, they're pretty much on board with the idea of evolution. Some of them come from families that have some resistance.
Yeah.
And a couple of times I've had students in my class come to me and say, my family is horrified that I'm taking evolution classes, and what can I tell them, and so on. And I've had in my anatomy and physiology class more often, I've had more often had students who had some religious issue because they're taking anatomy and physiology because they're physical therapists, for example. So right. I would say they're not as fully committed to the philosophy of science.
Sure.
When they're there to be trained for a particular occupation.
What advice would you give if someone came up to you and said, "Look, I've got family"? I mean, do you get quite strident? You would say, "Well, obviously, the truth is obvious," or are you a bit more? How would you go about advising someone?
Well, I think I'm a little more, and in my book, that question is addressed. I mean, it never pays to be antagonistic to say, well, you're just an idiot,
Yeah.
Someone who's occasionally someone who has less patience for that gets in trouble, like Richard Dawkins. He occasionally gets in trouble because, and I can completely understand that. I mean, you can tell by the look on his face that he's thinking, with some of these people he speaks to, he's thinking, you're an idiot, And I try to take a little bit more conciliatory approach. I'm not criticizing his approach. It has its place, but
I think you're right, and I think when you're involved in teaching, you know, at the coalface, I think that the conciliatory approach is much, and trying to understand your audience more is absolutely vital. And you're right, and that's what I like about the book itself, which is an introductory book for those, you know, on the journey into this sort of world of scientific naturalism. Is that it does have that balanced approach. It's not aggressive. It's not your strident, militant kind of atheist, you know, that you see, which, as you say, has its place. It's not that kind of book. What inspired you to write this book? What's the thought process behind it?
Well, it was partly largely my interaction with students. And the school that I teach at, Springfield College, has as their motto, spirit, mind, and body. And they adapted the triangle from the YMCA, because years ago in the 1800s, our school was affiliated with the YMCA. It was originally originated as the YMCA training school, and many years ago, in the early 20th century, it became a secular college. But they retained the triangle from the YMCA, which is spirit, mind, and body. And I had taken the position that we spend a lot of time on the mind and body part, but we don't really spend much time on the spirit part for students who are not religious. You know, they offer religious services on Sunday, things like that. But my question was, what about secular students? What about students who have a scientific worldview? And what about the spiritual aspects of that? You know, how does science explain or answer some of the questions that are typically answered by religion? Where did we come from? What's our purpose in the universe? Those kinds of questions. And there are scientific answers to some of them, like where did we come from? And some of them, what's our purpose, are more not in the realm of science. I mean, other than the scientific explanation for our purpose, which is that we're biological, carbon-based biological organisms living on the planet Earth, that's our purpose. But in terms of the larger human purpose, what's my reason for being here, people want some sort of answer. And while science doesn't provide any easy answers to something like that, it has some directions.
So, and I suppose what's interesting about the name of your book and what you're talking about there is this idea of spirituality, because that's can be in the secular world or in the you know, naturalistic, scientific world, a kind of controversial term, can't it? Spirituality. But I was actually reading Carl Sagan. I was reading Carl Sagan's A Demon Haunted World recently, and he talks a lot in chapter 2, I think it is, talks a lot about this spirituality and science not being in conflict with this idea of spirituality. And obviously it depends how you define the word. So broadly for you, how would you define spirituality?
Well, that's a very good question, because many people, in fact, some of the people, when I was working on the book, people I had sent it to read and for comments and so on, initially had some objection to the word spirituality, because it implies something supernatural to some people, the spirit world, or you know, what does spirituality mean? But I prefer Carl Sagan's approach. There's a quote in the book where right at the beginning, Carl Sagan, a quote from Carl Sagan from The Demon Haunted World, where he says, science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our in an immensity of light years and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual. And that's the approach I get. I mean, I find it to be a profoundly spiritual experience just to take a walk in the woods, and to see the life around me and appreciate how that all got there.
It's almost an experiential thing, isn't it? It's a human experience of awe and wonder that you don't need to insert some kind of unnecessary entity that some people might call God into explaining, right? So it's almost, or for me, and I presume for yourself as well, it's almost like you can get more spiritual or more a greater sense of awe and wonder from joining the dots in a very naturalistic way.
Exactly. And Dawkins has also, I think, mentioned that understanding what causes a rainbow does not take away the wonder and enjoyment of a rainbow. In fact, it enhances it.
Yeah,
And
of course.
it's the same thing that, you know, in a sense, the traditional, and I know that most religious people don't take this position anymore, that Earth is the center of the universe and humans are the center of creation. But I take that as a more narrow view. That traditional view is actually, to me, much narrower and more selfish. And when people say sometimes, well, oh, you don't believe in God, then don't you believe in anything bigger than yourself? Well, understanding the scope of the universe and understanding where life came from on Earth, how life got to be the way it is now on Earth, is profoundly more a sense of something bigger than yourself, and that comes from science.
And I think, to go back to what you're saying about meaning and the purpose we give ourselves, so absent of a God, it becomes very much more a personal thing, doesn't it? And it's very much, you could argue, a spiritual thing, right? In a secular sense. But I think I've always said it's far nobler to generate your own meaning in life than have some greater entity or design into you or define a purpose for you. You know,
Exactly.
to create your own meaning is a far more noble enterprise than just going about your business expected to do and be and have the purpose of being exactly what this greater entity expects of you.
And we talk about that in the book also. I mentioned the fact that, I use as an example the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that there was a person, Candy Lightner, who found her purpose in life from a tragedy, but has done a tremendous amount of good because of it. And in that sense, sometimes life hands you a purpose, and other times you have to find your own. But I think, you know, you can find a purpose in life doing something greater than yourself without having to resort to religion. I don't think that particularly engaging in rituals, does not necessarily give you purpose in life.
And which is interesting. That brings me on to something that you talk a lot about further on in the book, which is this kind of idea that at the end of the day, humans we have rituals in religion for a reason, right? So things that we might, as secular people, say are nonsensical in terms of that ritual doesn't gain you anything, it's a silly ritual, whatever. But the reasons why we have rituals can be explained in naturalistic ways. And so therefore, if you take religion out of our lives, or you take God out of our lives, we are still going to have those needs, those psychological needs that we would need to find outside of Orthodox religion. And so therefore you start getting these movements, whether it be the Sunday Assembly or these other kind of secular movements that are now recognizing the importance of such rituals, and I say that in a loose way, that we are now getting this burgeoning provision of secular organizations with their own kind of structures and rituals that allow us to be these kind of ritualistic beings, but without God. And I think your book talks a lot about that towards the end.
Yes, I mean, there are organizations that engage in what I guess you could say ritualistic behavior, but from a secular point of view. But I mean, we also have secular rituals that we engage in all the time, such as graduations. I mean, having gone to dozens of graduation ceremonies, there's not much more ritualistic than a graduation ceremony.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We're big fans of rituals and you know, doing the same things. We're creatures of habit, I suppose, aren't we?
Really?
So, given that the book is largely extolling the virtues of a scientific worldview, what do you think are the limits to science, perhaps, that we may face?
Well, I mean, the purpose of science is that it's a tool for figuring out how the natural world works. And it has those limits. That it's not anything else. It's not a system of belief. It's simply a tool for figuring out how the natural world works. And there's no better tool than that. Whatever anybody says about other ways of knowing, there is no other way of understanding the natural world that works as well as science. And some people think that that means that you're saying that science is perfect. Or people will say, "Oh, you're a scientist. You think you know everything," you know. And quite the contrary. One of the most pervasive aspects of being a scientist is a real appreciation for how much we don't know. I mean, I remember in my education, two important realizations. First, and this rarely happens as an undergraduate. You have to get further into the woods before you begin to appreciate this. But my first thought when I started to learn more biology, I remember being surprised at what we knew and thinking, "Oh, I didn't know we knew that. We know that." But then as I learned more, I started to realize what we don't know.
Mm.
And that was even more profound, but we don't know that. And there are still questions that we don't know. So the limits of science in that sense are that there are many profound and important questions about the natural world that we don't know. However, I'm confident that science will come up with these answers. For example, how is it that neurons, which are present in all other vertebrates and operate essentially the same, certainly in other mammals, how is it that in humans it gives us consciousness and self-awareness and abstract thinking, which does not exist to that extent in any other species? And we don't understand that. There's no magical soul. There's no magic about the human brain. It's just a brain like any other brain, and yet somehow it crossed the threshold to give us what we have now. We don't understand that. We don't know what causes cancer. I mean, we do know what causes cancer, but we don't know the details of how to interfere with the process, although we've made tremendous progress on that. Many, many more people are surviving than used to, but we still don't fully have the grasp of that. We don't have an understanding of how the universe began. We have theories about that, but it's very hard to establish things like that. And so there are many things like that we don't. So in that sense, there's the limit of science. But there's also the limit of science in that its only purpose is to describe the physical world, the natural world. And so there are many other problems we have to solve that don't involve that. And in some cases, I think our biggest challenge is the problem that science has created, which is the world population. Until very, very, very recently in human history, humans lived in a sort of natural relationship with disease and starvation and so on. And most people died before, half the people died before they reached the age of 15. And the average life expectancy was somewhere in the mid-30s. And very few people survived into very old age. And two things that really made a difference was, well, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, when we began to replace human labor with machine labor. But really, the real turning point in my mind was the germ theory of disease. By the late 1800s, when it was finally understood that infectious diseases caused by microorganisms, that really began a tremendous increase in human life expectancy and human survival. And so the population went from 1 billion to 7 billion in about 150 years. And that's caused some problems. Combine that with the agricultural revolution of the mid-20th century, when we significantly reduced starvation. Not to say that there aren't people who are hungry today, but the proportion of the human species that is hungry is much smaller than it used to be. And as a result, we now have over 7 billion people, which has caused...
I suppose this is the law of unintended consequences, right? So where science gives you the answer or helps you out, so in the sense of, right, disease and poverty and feeding ourselves high yield crops or whatever it may be, science gives us an answer and it is a useful tool. But then we have to rely on science again to get us out the problems that we got ourselves into by using the tool of science. And that's not the fault of science. It's just, not how knowledge works, isn't it? And it is how human behavior works. So we'll find a solution to one problem that unfortunately means we have further problems down the line. Sorry?
I'm sorry, I was just going to say the world population problem, which means we need food, we need housing, we need healthcare, we need medical care for possible pandemics like we're having right now, and that's, I mean, the pandemic we have now is partly caused by the fact that we have such a high population, especially high population density in some places, and such free travel around the world. So exactly what you said, it's an unintended consequence of the advances of science, are that we now face new problems that we didn't have to face before. And my point about the limitations of science is that, unfortunately, science can be said to have caused this problem, and yet science is not the total solution. We can come up with scientific answers like improved vaccinations, improved crop yields, and so on. But the complete solution to how the human species is going to deal with this existential crisis that's facing us, meaning the consequences of our population, has to come from other things besides just science. Some of the technical solutions may be helpful, but we have to have political solutions. We have to have philosophical solutions.
And I think you're absolutely right.
And there are some aspects to human nature. There are some aspects to human nature that may even be impediments. Our tendency to reason irrationally, and our selfishness. Some of those things can be impediments to figuring out how to solve this problem.
And I think
witness the example about the selfishness. Witness the fact that you can't find toilet rolls anywhere in stores in most of the civilized world now.
Yeah. So I think going back to the point about the limits of science, you get into the metaphysical realm and you might be starting to talk about philosophy and morality. And I've always said that politics is moral philosophy, just on a societal level rather than the individual level. So it comes back to, right, science is a tool that we can use to help us, but really it comes down to, and I've long said this, it comes down to the question you need to ask is, where do we want to be? And that's a very, I don't know that science can necessarily answer that, which is what it can help us answer that, because we can say, right, well-being, we can best find, this is kind of what Sam Harris sort of does, which we can, if we assume that we want well-being, then science can tell us how best we might get that for the most amount of people or whatever. But the question is, for me, is very much a philosophical one that needs to be answered first, which is, what society do we want? Or what world do we want? What do we want the world to look like? And that once we've got that goal in place, which is kind of a moral, more esoteric idea, once we've said, right, this is the kind of world we want, then we can get the gears in motion and use science to help us to get there. But yeah, as you rightly say, it's the best mechanism. It's got that self-correcting ideal. It's the best mechanism to find out the knowledge about how we get there, isn't it? I mean, what other systems are there? You know, religion hasn't really told us anything new in 2,000 years.
Well, the question of whether science is the best tool is also not just a matter of opinion. And of course, the world population is the most concrete example. The fact that we now, on average, have twice the life expectancy that we once had until very, very recently. I think there's no more concrete proof that science works in that sense. You know, the predictive value of science is unequaled. But as you said, it has the self-correcting feature. And many people find that unsatisfying because science, real science, says this is the best explanation we have so far, but we could be wrong. And many people don't want to hear that. They want to hear certainty. And science says, no, we're constantly changing our ideas about how this works.
Yeah, that's something Carl Sagan talks about in his book as well, which is, you know, people going out and trying to disprove things that you think are sound facts. You know, Newtonian physics used to be just an established fact of a universal fact of matter. And of course, when we start talking about quantum or special relativity or general relativity, you know, these things actually start unpicking other received ideas of how the world works, and that's the glory of science, and what drives people on in the scientific community is never rests on its laurels, right?
Exactly. And in fact, in writing this book, I spent a few years writing it, actually, and sometimes when I put it down for a couple of months to do my regular job, and then came back to more intensely look at what I'd written, things had changed. This book has some of the scientific facts in this book have changed as I was writing it. But as we say, that's a feature, not a bug in science.
And the other thing I like about science is it's a great analogy, the horse racing analogy, which is that, you know, in times gone past where we would explain thunder and lightning as the wrath of Thor or whatever. And as we gain more knowledge, a supernatural explanation would be supplanted by a naturalistic explanation. And it's gone that way every single time. 10,000 times, the supernatural has been supplanted by the naturalistic, and it's never gone the other way. We've never had an established scientific and naturalistic understanding of how something happened and then replaced it with a supernatural explanation. So if you're looking at, like you said before, consciousness or how the universe started, you can bet on a horse that has won 10,000 times, or you can bet on a horse that's never won, you know?
Well, in that sense, you know, another use of the word faith. I mean, I have faith that the problems can be solved by science. We may not have solved them yet, but I would call that a certain amount of faith, not faith in something without evidence, but faith that it has won the race 10,000 times. So I have faith that it's going to win the race in the future.
Where faith is defined by inductive reasoning. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I suppose that kind of answers a question I was going to ask you, which is how do you think science and morality, what crossover is there? I mean, can science answer moral questions?
Well, I think to some extent, and I think Sam Harris has talked about this, is that we have an understanding of what's necessary for a comfortable life. And some of that comes from science. So we know, for example, how pain works. And we can understand scientifically a little bit about reducing suffering from things like that. We can reduce suffering nutritionally by understanding what people need to eat, what prevents nutritional deficiency diseases, things like that. But it goes beyond human beings. I mean, people used to think it was that suffering, or that you had to have consciousness to have suffering. and that therefore you had to have a soul. And since animals don't have a soul, according to that belief system, you didn't have to worry about their suffering. And so people would, in the Middle Ages, people would torture animals for fun,
Well,
entertain
later
them.
than that, was it Descartes who was involved in that kind of idea that the animals didn't have souls and therefore you could basically, do with them what you will.
Right. And now we understand, certainly mammals have very similar nervous systems. And we know that a mammal probably experiences pain similar to the way we do. Now, they don't have the psychological aspect. They don't think, why is this happening to me? This is so unfair. Am I going to die? When will this end? Those kinds of things, in a sense, amplify the suffering in human beings. But in animals, we do know they experience pain. And so we've changed our attitude towards animal suffering. In most places, it's illegal to deliberately hurt animals.
Yeah. Yeah, and that of course that plays merry havoc with ideas of theology, whereby humans, you can explain human pain and suffering in terms of we've done wrong here and we've but when it comes to animal pain and suffering, a fawn dying in a forest fire or a tsunami killing countless ecosystems, is a little bit more difficult to explain in terms of a loving God and whatnot. Speaking of which, have you ever been religious? Have you gone through a deconversion, or have you just, was it part of your upbringing? Do you have any sort of religious upbringing?
In my case, it's been I would say easier than for some people, because my parents were atheists. My grandparents, at the time of my grandparents, it would have been more like agnostic, and I don't think they even had a label for it.
Yeah.
But remembering the conversations with my grandparents and the fact that they did not practice any religious beliefs, it was apparent that my grandparents were at least agnostic.
Yeah.
And in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, people weren't so conscious about trying to label it in such a way. But I remember growing up asking my grandparents questions about that, and it was clear that they did not have a particular religious belief either. So that made it easy for me. And my parents were critical thinkers. My father was an engineer. My mother was an editor. And they were critical thinkers. And they raised me that way, to be a critical thinker. I remember my mother explaining evolution to me when I was a little kid. So, how evolution works. And so, no, it was not, but I know it can be a very painful experience for some people to let go of their religion. And I understand that. And especially when they get to college and they start to learn more and start to see that a scientific worldview is not compatible with the belief in the supernatural. It's very hard to let go of the things that you were taught as a child, religion particularly.
Yeah, when it's so embroiled in your identity, but not just your identity, you also your social networks, your comfort blankets, both the kind of, I suppose, a metaphysical comfort blanket.
I mean, in many cases, some people will be ostracized from their community if they give up their religion.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting is the cultural difference in America to Britain. In Britain, we have religious apathy. We've had religious apathy for decades and decades, where you don't talk about religion here. The old thing used to be you don't talk about religion and politics, right? Nowadays, everyone loves talking about religion and politics, but most people are still massively apathetic to religion. Our state religion, if you like, was Church of England, which was basically really nominal. Go once in a blue moon and sing a nice little hymn.
I always liked Eddie Izzard's take on the Church of England: cake or death.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. He's great. But and so therefore there was never any. If you did deconvert in Britain, so what? And if you were an atheist, so what? And that's still apparent. In fact, it's more interesting if you're religious in Britain. It's like, oh, that's a bit weird. Whereas in America, it's just completely different.
It's an interesting difference because this is not my area, but some people think that the reason for that difference is that religion was more pervasive in Europe, controlled your lives, people were killed for their religious beliefs, whereas here, at least since the founding of the United States, it's been more, because there's been more freedom of religion and the government has kept its hands off of religion, or supposed to, it has resulted in more fervent religious belief.
Yeah,
Whereas in Europe, it's more of a reaction against the oppression that religion has subjected people to for centuries.
it's an interesting evolution, isn't it, in America? And I don't know whether the Puritans also played a part in that. And what you've got this weird scenario where you're a secular country, as you say, but you're fundamentally religious, and we're a religious country but fundamentally secular. It's kind of weird.
Right.
So, do you you obviously don't face any issues, as you said, with regard to science and religion in your teaching, in your private life with teachers at college? I mean, are you publicly atheist, or do you keep it quiet? Do people look at you strangely for what you say in the staff room, or?
I am publicly atheist because I'm publicly a scientist. The
Yeah.
atheism is simply a consequence of taking a scientific worldview. That's something that I emphasize to students in particular, is atheism is not a belief system. Atheism, meaning that you don't believe in supernatural causes and supernatural gods, comes from a scientific understanding of how the world works.
So that's linked to your methodological naturalism.
Exactly. And the methodological naturalism leads to the metaphysical naturalism. And that would be my message to students is, I don't ask you to stop believing in God. I don't ask you to give up religion. I ask you to think scientifically and come to your own conclusions. If you think critically, if you have a scientific understanding, then I have confidence that you will come to rational conclusions. And I have I'm not interested in proselytizing atheism.
Yeah.
I'm interested in proselytizing critical thinking and science.
Well said. Yeah, very good. So if you were, and I think I can guess what your answer might be, but because you've kind of already said this, but what do you think the most exciting, maybe these are two questions. What do you think is the most exciting thing that science can answer, or might be able to answer, or you would want it to answer? So the most exciting thing and the most important thing.
Well, I think the most important thing is figuring out how to go forward with the population we have, how to control it, and how to provide for everyone's needs, and not have 1 billion people living in poverty and near starvation, but to provide a decent quality of life, health care, food, education, shelter, and so on.
And I would throw in ecological biodiversity into that as well.
I'm sorry?
I would throw into that ecological biodiversity.
Exactly. Protecting the climate, protecting the life on Earth. I mean, multiple species are going extinct every day. And we face, again, the possibility of an ecological collapse. So
I think, sorry to interrupt, I think scientists have established that we are in the 6th extinction era at the moment. I think statistically, this is an extinction era.
I think that's correct, that if it's at all controversial, it won't be in a little while. And it's a serious and not to overuse the word, an existential problem. And that, I think, is the biggest thing. And then there are smaller things, but I think the biggest thing is how to survive the next 100 years. Yeah. without a major collapse of the ecosystem the biosphere and the human species.
Yeah. And is there an exciting thing outside of that? Is there something that you think, oh, I wish science could give me the answer to that?
Well, a few things I may have mentioned already. A final and complete cure for cancer would be nice. I mean, these are smaller technical things, not the big picture, but the smaller technical things. Another one would be the equivalent of antibiotics for viruses. I mean, we have methods for inhibiting viral replication that are reasonably successful, but we still don't have something that you can take and then you can stop taking it because now the virus is gone. I mean, in most cases, viral medicines that fight viruses, you need to keep taking them. And we still haven't figured out a way to eliminate the risk or the damage of viruses as completely as antibiotics do.
So
that's
for
an
me,
important technical.
and that's hugely important. And for me, it would be something like an explanation, a full explanation of consciousness. Exactly.
That was the next thing I was going to say, because and my wife is a psychologist,
right?
So and a neuropsychologist. So
oh wow, there must be some interesting dinner time conversations.
Exactly. So she studies brain and she knows way more about it than I do, and you know that is she knows where we stand on that. But there's also, I mean, there's two questions. There's the biological answer, which is how does the brain work and create consciousness? And then there's the technical question of artificial intelligence. Can we recreate that artificially? And that would certainly be a turning point in human history if we have true artificial intelligence.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, I think we've probably covered most things there, and that's a really interesting romp through science and to some degree spirituality. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Is there anything else you wanted to mention with regard to the book?
No, I do want to thank you for all the work you've put in on the book, and I really appreciate that. I would encourage anybody who has questions, things they'd like to see us address in future work, to contact me. And I would love to hear feedback about it.
Yeah.
What do you think was left out that you would have liked to have seen?
Well, I'll leave details on the video concerning all of that. But thanks, Joe. It's been a really interesting talk, and good luck with the book, and hopefully see you posting occasionally on A Tippling Philosopher if you have the wherewithal and the good nature and have something to say. You're always welcome to throw in a word or two there. But thanks very much, Joe.
Thank you very much.